Hello and welcome to the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast, the show all about psychology and changing behaviour. My name is Jamie West. I'm a writer, musician and performer, and I'm joined by Professor Emeritus of UCL fame, Professor Robert West. How are you, Robert?
I'm very good, Jamie. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, I am good. Thank you for not asking. Now, we have been looking at decision-making in this series, and we're currently in a clutch of episodes. I don't know why I'm using the word clutch so often these days, but I'm enjoying it as for a collection of things. We are now doing a series of episodes looking at the background of how we make decisions and how our brains interpret the world. Last episode, we were looking at bias, and, well, we really just scratched the surface, so we are going to continue talking about bias in this episode as well, because there's so much going on with our brains. And I wanted to start with, let's see, there are so many. So many. Actually, before we do, for those people who are familiar with Tversky and Kahneman, the famous researchers who... Thinking Fast and Slow, I think was the title.
That'll be Danny Kahneman. And so they did work on heuristics and biases. And when people think about biases, they automatically think about the ones that Tversky and Kahneman talk about. I'm going to make a potentially controversial claim.
Right up front,
which is that I think that the kinds of biases that they focus on are in many cases not really necessarily maladaptive biases. And we're going to, we can discuss this later, but in real world scenarios, actually, although they look like biases when the decisions are taken in isolation, if you take decisions in clutches, for example, they actually quite adaptive. But more importantly than that, they're not really the big ones. They're not the ones that really mess up people's decision-making. So the ones that we're going to mainly talk about today, we will talk a little bit about Tversky and Kahneman's biases like the availability heuristic, ones that are arising from that. But they're not the big ones. The big, we talked about one of the massive ones last time, which was wishful thinking and basically believing what you want to believe.
Well, okay. Well, the thing is, I have a load of biases. I don't know which ones are ones that Tversky and Kahneman put. I have read the book, but it was some time ago, so I can't remember exactly which ones are in there. I was thinking of starting with false dichotomies, black and white thinking.
Yeah, so let's do that.
I'm doing it. I'm literally doing it. So this could be something like nature versus nurture. So this is where it's a false dichotomy. And I remember learning about this, and it's very helpful because people often frame things to you as a dichotomy, and it's often a false dichotomy. And then you're left answering a question which usually ends up being, well, if it's nature versus nurture, well, it's both, but you've got to look at it and then in what proportions. Sometimes it doesn't feel that helpful. So, I mean, of course it can prompt a discussion, but it also can be used, particularly in persuasion or arguments. Do you want this or do you want that? Yeah. What kind of world do you want to live in? And then it pushes you down a certain path.
Yes, that's right. And I would say that false dichotomies and black and white thinking are related, but they're not exactly the same thing. So we can sort of treat them a little bit separately. But let's just start with the false dichotomies. And you're absolutely right that they are used as persuasive devices. Can I just say,
actually, as you're saying that, I have used ChatGPT to summarize the elements of the chapter of the book that we're writing on this. And that was a classic example of, I know that black and white thinking and false dichotomies are not necessarily the same thing. But when it was in front of me, written down with a little logo beside it, with a little black circle and a white circle, I was like, okay, right, just get on with that. And I've looked at that several times. It's not as if I haven't looked at it, but I just didn't think about it.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. It's a modern day version of a phenomenon that used to happen many years ago when people didn't have access to printing and typewriters and printers and things like that, where if you saw something in TypeScript, you thought, ooh, that must be true.
It's true. I think that's that. I do notice that. I mean, it was just demonstrated that happened to me using ChatGPT, but I've noticed it in other times. They're like, oh, it's written down from this something that feels like an authority. And I know they've been doing some research into that as well, actually, about how we view the large language models as an authority in some ways because of this, presumably much the same psychological mechanism.
I think we need to find a good name for this bias that is a very important bias. The first one that comes to my mind is gullibility bias.
Yeah, we might have to find one that doesn't make people feel bad. Somebody might have already thought of one. Anyway, we're talking about false dichotomies. Go for it. Okay,
so false dichotomies. So yeah, as you say, this is where two things are set up in opposition to each other when in fact they're not in opposition to each other, or there's more than two things. The nature-nurture debate is actually a really interesting one because it doesn't matter how often this gets explained that this is a false dichotomy. It really doesn't matter. It's such a strong false dichotomy. It's such a one that feels so natural to us to make that it just persists. I mean, it's still, you'd think it would have gone away, when someone explained, well, hang on a minute, that's like arguing that the surface area of a table is actually determined by its length rather than its width. You think, well, hang on a minute, So, but actually, oh God, shall I? Yeah, okay, I shall. It goes a little bit into our understanding of causality and the way that we kind of misunderstand causality. Because if you think about in the nature-nurture debate, if you think about it, for half a second, without the nature bit, without your genes, you got nothing. So they're 100% responsible for everything, right? I mean, you don't exist. And as a species, all the things that you're capable of doing as a human being are coming from the fact that your genes are programming you as a human being. The more rational part, and this is the key point, the more rational part of the debate is to what extent is the variation in some phenotype that you see, let's say height or weight or intelligence or anxiety or whatever, to what extent is the variation that you see in that attributable to the variation that you see in the underlying genotype or the variation in the environment? Now, that is a very different question, but it's a more meaningful question. In an environment in which you've got a really strong schooling system, an educational system, which acts to bring people's cognitive abilities and their knowledge and so on up to a certain level, then you're going to see more influence from the genotype relative to the environment, because the environment is compensating for a genotypic variation. And so you'll see what we currently see in the UK, which is that the heritability of something like IQ or educational attainment even is in the region of 80%. You think, oh my God, our intelligence is 80% determined, but it's not that at all. It's that we have an environment which promotes a given level of educational attainment or IQ or cognitive ability for people across a broad range of genotypes. So when you've got high genetic variation and let's say a limited environmental variation or environmental variation that compensates for that, you're going to see high, what we call heritability. That's not the same thing as saying that intelligence is genetically determined. The reason I sort of bang on about this, partly because it's interesting in its own right, in my view, but also partly because it's a very nice example of how this sort of false dichotomy misleads us. And actually, the way to counteract it is to unpick what it is that the propositions are that you're making. What your decisions are. And we already, earlier on in this series, talked about the different decision frames. Shall I do this or not? Or shall I do this or that? Those can be set up for you as false dichotomies. Well, hang on a minute. I don't need to do either of those things. So, it's very common, very common.
It's quite interesting to think about when it's useful, when it's not useful to set something up as a dichotomy, because of course what you've done is you've reduced your information. There can be in the world, we can get overloaded with information. And so we go, hang on a minute, I've got to get this down into something I can understand. And so you go, right, I can either do this or I can do that, And so I think that it can make sense depending on the circumstance that you're in.
Yeah, we need to simplify things, for sure. The world is a very complicated place. The question is, what do you lose in that? And as I bang on about quite a lot, the critical thing is when you do this kind of simplification, or when you think about anything or form a value judgment or whatever, always be reflective about it. Always, that the thing that you should always have in your mind is, I might be wrong. This might not be the best way of doing it. And it's when you lose that reflectiveness that all of these kind of wishful thinking biases, false dichotomy biases, and so on, all of which can serve a function in certain circumstances, that is when they become maladaptive, because you're locked into a particular mode of thinking. And quite often you become emotionally tied to that way of thinking in a way that means that you draw, false conclusions that you could have. It's not that the world is so complicated that you couldn't have done a better job. You could have done a better job.
But hang on a second. You can't always be in a state of doubt about and uncertainty over the decisions that you're making. Is it not more likely, because you've got to act many times with conviction with what you're doing? That's quite something that people desire, is a leader who says, I know where we're going. And then you think, well, I'm going to follow that person because they seem to have some certainty. Now, that can backfire, of course. But a leader who was always full of doubt the whole time, at least, or projecting that surely wouldn't be very effective.
I think that certainty and reflectiveness is a false dichotomy. I actually do think that we should always be not full of doubt, but full of reflectiveness.
Well, I mean, always is that's sort of a black and white thinking already, isn't it?
God, we're getting caught up there. Anyway, let's say most of the time, or a lot of the time, if things that matter, a lot of things don't matter. And, you can take this decision, that decision, you can go down this route, and who knows, sometimes it looks as though it doesn't matter and it turns out that it does. But, that's fine. But the big stuff, the stuff that, that obviously matters and that you should be giving some serious thought to, whether it's how you vote in an election, in my opinion, or, a career choice, or, so many of these big decisions we make, or in your professional life, these are the things that we really need to always have in the back of our mind. I might be wrong. And you're not saying I doubt my decision. You're just saying I have a certain level of confidence. As you know, Jamie, and anyone else who knows me, I am a pretty strict Bayesian when it comes to probability judgments. which is to say that the world provides you with information in incrementally, and your confidence in your conclusions should respond accordingly, and your confidence should almost never go to 0 or 1, because once that's happened, there's no way that you can adjust your level of confidence. Once you're totally certain about something, it's not it's not something you can then change. So even if you're 99.99999% confident in something, be that. Don't be 1.
It's a good question, isn't it? Because we feel uncomfortable outside of certainties. We want to have certainties, and we feel emotionally often, this is just the way our brains often work, is we go, oh, the gray area, oh, this, as we've spoken about many times, the cognitive dissonance comes into play when you're trying to hold two kind of opposing thoughts in your mind at the same time. And that is a real challenge for the human brain. It can leave us sort of, paralyzed with indecision.
It can do, and I think people should just get over it. Myself. Okay, right, being slightly less flippant, I think that I don't think it's ever a question of being, or it should never be a question of being paralyzed by indecision. And I don't think having an appropriate level of confidence for some judgment that you're making necessarily leads to indecision. You can say, let's take a very contentious subject that's still sort of why not that still sort of upsets people at the moment, which is Brexit. The decision to leave the European Union.
I didn't know where you were going there.
You had no. It could have been a lot of places. But let's take that. People feel very, very. People felt very confident, certain, in fact. But of course, the reality is that with a complicated decision like that, you're never sure exactly how things are going to turn out. And so it would be perfectly reasonable to say, I'm going to vote, to remain in the European Union. Because on balance, I think my judgment is that things will turn out better for us all if we do that, while recognizing that there are some downsides to that, and that there's a lot there's a lot of unpredictability here. But you can say on balance, and what is more, I firmly stick by that decision. That is a well-argued, supported decision that because it takes account, it's not just some sort of simplistic view. It should be more robust and able to stand up to the kind of opposition that it might then face. So you could argue, and I think I would, that decisions that are made on a more sort of realistic basis with regard to judgments of probabilities and so on, can be and ought to be more robust.
This takes us back, this discussion on probabilities, I think, to an earlier discussion we had in the series about focusing on the process of decision-making and having confidence in the process while being aware that the process may not always lead to the outcome that you might desire. So actually, in focusing on the process, one has to accept, I would argue, that nothing is certain. Very little is certain going into the future. And so you're always dealing with some levels of probability. And therefore, you need to start getting confident with going, maybe you put a number on it. I'm 70%, I feel like I'm 70% sure or something that this action is going to yield the result I want, but also to be prepared for it to not work out as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So not only are judgments that are based on a more realistic appraisal of the scenario you're in and probabilities, not only are they more robust, but they are also more adaptive in the sense that when things happen that weren't what you expected, you are more ready for that and ready to adjust for that eventuality. Whereas if you've said, no, this is the right thing to do, we're doing this regardless, and you haven't thought through the possible negative outcomes that might arise if things don't go how you want, then you're going to be stuck. So I think there's so many good reasons for we were sort of straying into black and white thinking a little bit here, actually, because when you think about things in terms of certainties, or this is definitely not true and this is definitely true, then that is the kind of black and white thinking. But I think that it seems weird to me that one should have to argue the case, and yet one does, but argue the case that we should think about things carefully in a quantitative way, in which we as accurately as we can in the circumstances characterize the options available to us, and be ready to handle things that may happen that we weren't expecting.
Well, let's take another false dichotomy, which is the idea that you either succeed or you fail. I am either a success or I am a failure. That comes into labeling and identity and judgment. But let's just take it, not going right down into the judgment level of who we are as people. But very often when we have projects, we do think, is this a success? Is it a failure? And the false dichotomy limits our appreciation of the subtlety of this worked, that didn't work, and arguably makes things a lot more tense and stressful than they might otherwise be.
Yes, absolutely they do. I mean, I'm going to argue the position that you often are arguing, which is, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's some sort of adaptive advantage to having this kind of approach, which is, and what I'm going to say is that in situations where you have to make a decision, let's say you're a couple and you've got to decide whether or not you want children or not. Well, you can't have a bit of a child. You can only either have a child or not have a child, right? So in those kinds of decisions,
you could visit a child.
I'm sure they'd be more than happy to be visited by someone. Oh, look. So, there are decisions where you've got to come down, like voting decisions, you on one side or another. And that's so the decision act itself is kind of naturally tailored to this sort of false dichotomy approach. The thing is that a lot of decisions aren't like that. And even when they are like that, we talked about revocable and irrevocable decisions and so on. They are adjustable potentially. And that's often why you need to have this more nuanced view of things.
I think the point that you were arguing against what I was saying, I mean, I was really talking about success and failure as concepts rather than just a kind of a binary decision. So, of course, I would agree with what you said there. I think it's just we can very easily fall into, I must have everything I want, otherwise I will not be happy. And that can be in our personal life. It can be as opposed to dealing with the reality of a situation. I mean, how many times do you have an unmitigated success or an unmitigated failure? It's so rare.
Yeah. Because
you learn things from failure anyway. So it's not irredeemable. It's very rarely so. It's hard to think of.
Sometimes they're irredeemable. But I think okay. So probably. Let me. I mean, just on the success failure thing, there's something that sort of struck me over the years, which is that when there's what happened, right, and that definitely happened, let's say, and then there's how you interpret what happened, or someone else interprets what happened, and for some reason, and obviously I know why it is in my head, but it still seems stupid to me. We get over, we focus rather too much on the people's interpretation of what happened rather than actually what happened. So, you got this score in an exam, right? You got the score. That's the score you got. Someone says, oh, that was disappointing, or that was, that's a failure or whatever. You go, well, it is what it is. What difference does it make whether what you think about it or what I think about it? It's the thing that it was. And there's so many situations like that where people get hung up on the labeling and the interpretation of what happened instead of saying, well, it doesn't matter what you say about it. This is what it was.
Interesting. I think I might have some differing views on that, but I will say this, that we are at the end of this episode and we just about got through false dichotomies there because
we didn't.
It was a fun one to talk through. So there are still more biases to go through. I'm sure that we will look at some of the other ones in upcoming episodes. But I enjoyed that, and it was contentious, and it was a robust discussion.
It was, and that's a great interpretation. The thing is, it was what it was.
Yeah, it is what it is. It was what it was. Anyway, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Robert. And thank you for listening wherever you are. And please remember to subscribe to the podcast. And we look forward to welcoming you next time on the Unlocking Behaviour Change podcast.